Hello and welcome to the China Unraveled podcast, your unfiltered source for what's going on inside China and what it means for the world. I'm your host, Jason Scheftel, and I also used to believe the China story we've all been told. But after living, studying, and traveling throughout the country, I now know better. China's past, present, and future are not what they've been made out to be. Over the last year, I've turned what I've learned into a book. While on here, I shed some light on the big issues. This is the second in a series about Hong Kong. Episode 6 covered the origins of Hong Kong, and today's episode dives into the city's history from World War II to the 1997 handover to mainland China. We'll cover the city's forgotten industrial history, the reasons for its astounding economic development, the relatively recent emergence of democracy, and Hong Kong's ambivalent relationship to mainland China. All to get a better sense for what defines southern China's most influential modern city. Let's learn just what it is Hong Kong and Beijing think they are fighting for. After World War II, the sun finally began to set on the British Empire, and around the world, colonial regimes were decomposing. In some places, this meant the first breath of freedom in generations. In others, like Hong Kong or Singapore, it was a lot less exhilarating. The world was now divided between two great superpowers, while Britain had shriveled back down to just the British Isles. It could no longer protect itself, let alone its tiny, vulnerable, and far-flung colonies. To survive in the post-war world, Hong Kong needed what it has always needed: trade. Remember, Hong Kong has none of the essential resources required for sustained human settlement. To this day, it imports everything: food, fuel, raw materials, even water, all the basic necessities of life. So Hong Kong needed to join a trading system, but the imperial era had ended, and all the old patterns of world trade had left with it. All prior imperial trading systems had been supplanted by a single U.S. system. Outside of this system, there was no expansionary network of international trade anywhere in the world. This left Hong Kong one option: ally with the United States. Otherwise, Hong Kong's port would be left barren, and soon there would be no food on the table or water coming out of the taps. Inadequate supplies would force the island to depopulate rather than repopulate, a common historical pattern in this part of China. Once in a trade network, Hong Kong still had to make itself useful. Before World War II, its value had come from coordinating trade with China. Then, Japan invaded China, the British Empire crumbled, and the 1949 Communist Revolution closed China off from the world yet again. So by 1950, what use was Hong Kong? Who needed an intermediary to the closed society of Communist China? Unless and until the mainland reopened, Hong Kong was no longer the gateway to anywhere. Hong Kong was no longer an entrepot, a term used to describe an important physical relay station for trade, a place where other people's goods are imported, stored, traded, and re-exported. Hong Kong could no longer pay for its imports by filtering other people's goods, and its new role was not self-evident. Hong Kong had to find something of value to export in exchange for all of its needed imports. This would be an uphill climb. Cities with no tangible or tradable resources do not suddenly become exporters. Nonetheless, Hong Kong had to try. To survive, it had to find some stable toehold in America's novel commercial order. Only afterwards could it try to refashion the unique borderland existence it had previously enjoyed as a wealthy, cosmopolitan city with one foot in two worlds. Outside of its harbor, Hong Kong has no natural resources. This meant its only export option was manufactured goods. And in a world of stainless steel, assembly lines, interchangeable parts, electricity, and gas turbines, manufactured goods means industrially manufactured goods. If Hong Kong got back on the map, it would be because it had transformed itself into an industrialized entrepot. Now, this should have been impossible. In any other era, it would have been impossible. On its own, Hong Kong lacks almost all of the land, labor, or capital inputs that make settlement possible. So that means it completely lacks all the inputs that make industrialized settlement possible. A good natural harbor may lead to a port, but a port does not naturally spawn an industrial economy. Let's quickly clarify how industrialization happens. It basically works like this. Cheap, energy-dense fuels, like coal or oil, are used to create new agricultural efficiencies, mechanical tools, and production processes. These expand and enhance the labor force and grow both consumer and capital markets, with everything feeding back into the system to create further improvements in a virtuous circle fed by lots and lots of capital. Hong Kong just did not have the labor, land, agricultural, technological, or capital base to industrialize. Of course, industrialization comes with consequences. The virtuous circle I just mentioned has a dark side. The economist Joseph Schumpeter once said that, quote, economic progress in capitalist society means turmoil, end quote. And this is spot on for the shockwaves of industrialization. Industrialization causes vicious societal disfigurement, painfully reconfiguring all production and employment patterns in a society. The labor strikes, wars, rebellions, and uprisings of the late 19th and early 20th century were par for the course for what industrialization demands of societies. But Hong Kong's back was already up against the wall, and industrialization opened up the only possible route to a larger, broader, and deeper economy built off of varied manufactured goods. Thankfully, Hong Kong had at least three things going for it. It had a British heritage and all the legacy institutions that come with that. It got an infusion of skilled labor, capital, and technology from businessmen fleeing China, especially industrialists from Shanghai. And most importantly, as a British colony, Hong Kong was part of the new US global trading system. Just as membership in the British imperial system is what made sustainable trade flows in early Hong Kong possible, membership in the American global system is what made an industrial Hong Kong possible. And this often forgotten industrial Hong Kong is what made modern financial Hong Kong possible. As covered in episode 4, after World War II, the US opened up its economy of 150 million people to foreign trade and used its military to ensure the free, secure flow of raw materials and processed goods all around the world. This is what let Hong Kong access international suppliers and external consumer markets. It can now be supplied materials to transform in the colony before selling the resulting consumer products to the developed world. And that is just what Hong Kong did. From 1950 to 1970, Hong Kong followed a model of export-oriented industrialization, just like Japan and Germany during the same time period. Specifically, Hong Kong exported standardized consumer goods to high-income Western countries while leaving the marketing to foreign wholesalers and retailers. It didn't sell cars and airplanes, but light industry, starting with textiles and then moving into sectors like plastics and electronics. It's worth diving a bit deeper into Hong Kong's industrialization process because it was just so remarkable and unusual. We're going to focus on textiles because that's what got the ball rolling for Hong Kong. The word textiles means fiber products, stuff like the clothing, rugs, drapes, blankets, and other cloth products we see every day. Historically, these fibers were natural and harvested from pastured animals like sheep or from planted crops like cotton. This close connection to agriculture is why textiles have played a key role in a number of industrial transformations. Once agricultural labor is freed up by productivity improvements, farmers are put to work processing goods made from these familiar agricultural products. Textiles were actually the first ever industrial consumer goods, way back during Britain's Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. And as mentioned, they were also the first industrial consumer goods in Hong Kong, except Hong Kong had no underlying agricultural sector. Hong Kong didn't have the farmland or grazing land or animals to produce food, let alone a surplus it could later transform into textiles. It also lacked the energy resources, metals, chemicals, machines, and capital to develop a textile processing industry. Hong Kong manufactured textiles without anything like a normal underlying economic base by sourcing raw materials from Southeast Asian countries, utilizing refugee labor and technology from China, buying capital goods from Western countries, and sending its processed goods to consumer markets around the world. If it weren't a member of the US trading system, Hong Kong would have needed its own private empire to make this happen. After all, that is precisely what the Japanese Empire tried to create just a few years earlier. It conquered most of North and Southeast Asia in order to sustain its newly industrial society. Yet in the post-World War II era, Hong Kong and Japan got all the benefits of having an empire without any serious costs. The biggest cost was a lack of control. Since Hong Kong didn't control the global system, its future was never fully in its own hands. Hong Kong has always been sensitive to every twist and turn of the market. Increased input costs, changing consumer preferences, currency movements, all of it could and did impact life in Hong Kong. No coordinated economic policy drove the colony's development during this time. It was not yet a democracy, and the colonial administration followed old-school laissez-faire economic policy. The undeniable success of Hong Kong's early entrepreneurs was to marshal the financing, raw materials, space, labor, business relationships, designs, and distribution channels necessary to make Hong Kong's continuous early growth a reality. But Hong Kong was not the only place given this near-miraculous opportunity to industrialize. And soon, everyone was fighting to take advantage of the largest, deepest, and most open markets in world history. And in this fight, Hong Kong had some serious limitations. All of Hong Kong's early industries were labor-intensive because Hong Kong's greatest resource at the time were the hundreds of thousands of people fleeing communist China. Although they seem different, offshore electronics manufacturing and textiles are actually similar because they both typically involve a labor-intensive but low-tech assembly process. This has been true whether the devices are PCs in the 90s or transistor radios in the 50s. Electronics production fed back into the economy can sometimes create significant industrial clusters and generate what economists call agglomeration economies. But this was not going to be Hong Kong's future. The city simply did not have the space. Manufacturing on a tiny, hilly, cramped collection of islands does not produce economies of scale. So once Hong Kong started to compete against countries with economies of scale, it began to lose. When Britain expanded Hong Kong to its present size in the late 1890s, the goal was not to expand the usable area of the colony. It was to create a mountainous protective zone around Hong Kong's core asset of Victoria Harbour. And it worked. 75% of Hong Kong is mountainous and uninhabitable. That is why Hong Kong has one of the highest population densities in the world. It is also why Hong Kong's famous skyline is so impressive. Its buildings don't just seem to be rising up above each other. They are rising up above each other because buildings built farther back are built up a sloping mountainside. Cities also do not build outdoor escalators unless they really, really have to. Hong Kong was meant to be a logistics hub, not a factory town. Industrial production requires a lot of land that Hong Kong just doesn't have. And in a free property market, industry is not the highest value use of that land. For example, according to Zillow, the total value of all residential property in the US is around $33 trillion, but the value of all commercial real estate is only half that. For a while, hyper-efficient logistics operations could make up for these limitations, but by the early 1970s, Hong Kong was becoming less competitive in labor-intensive manufacturing than nearby places like Malaysia and Thailand. Limited land soon became expensive land, and physical constraints on population size soon turned into rising labor costs. Even Hong Kong's population boom from 2 to 5 million people between 1950 and 1980 couldn't keep wages down. So to keep incomes rising, Hong Kong had to move away from the low-value, labor-heavy manufacturing of the 1950s and 60s, but it wouldn't be moving to advanced manufacturing. Hong Kong did not have the economic structure or government obsession to win that fight against Japan or Taiwan. So what did Hong Kong do? Well, just as Hong Kong's industrial future hit insurmountable structural obstacles, the city was handed yet another unprecedented opportunity. Hong Kong's final export was its own industrial sector. As China reopened in the late 1970s, Hong Kong started offshoring its industry to the mainland and in the process transformed itself into the logistical and financial nerve center of southern China. Mainland China solved Hong Kong's industrial problems. Labor costs across the border were 30 times cheaper than wages in the colony, and cheap, underutilized land was everywhere. China's quarter century of bleak, non-commercial life also made the skills that had built Hong Kong into an industrial city extremely valuable, both to new Chinese businessmen and state companies building enterprises and integrating them into the world economy. Hong Kong's open, competent system also shined in comparison to China's still closed state. Hong Kong had no customs duties, quotas, restrictions on capital entry or exit, restrictions on profits or dividends from investment, or even limits on foreign ownership of land or business assets in Hong Kong. The city was frequently rated the freest economy in the world. It was in the 1980s when Hong Kong really started to gain both the economy and the reputation it has today. Hong Kong leveraged its ties with the mainland, ties with emigrant Chinese populations, ties into international trade, and ties with global financial firms and associated services to become the major offshore location for all intermediation with China. And as Hong Kong offloaded its old manufacturing industries onto the mainland, it moved into the higher value areas of finance, logistics, business consulting, and trade and professional services. Factories disappeared, but dense financial networks spawned on top of the old production links, a development pattern similar to Amsterdam in the 16th and 17th century, London since the 18th century, and New York since the 19th century. Capital, ideas, products, and people surged through the city. Hong Kong marketed China and Chinese products to the world. Westerners came to Hong Kong to do business with China, and Chinese people with training in ideology rather than sales went through Hong Kong to do business with the West. According to the Rand Corporation, over 60% of foreign direct investment into China from 1979 to 1995 came through Hong Kong. And by 1997, Hong Kong accounted for 80% of all foreign direct investment in the Pearl River Delta. Hong Kong transformed into a logistics hub for re-export and processing throughout China's manufacturing powerhouse in the Pearl River Delta, as well as across its southern coast. By the late 90s, Hong Kong's seaport was the largest and most active in the world. Even in 2020, its airport remains the largest cargo airport in the world, as well as one of the largest passenger airports. As Hong Kong reached the physical limits of growth, land prices skyrocketed. Hong Kong was well on its way to having the most expensive property market in the world and in an economy dominated by finance, logistics, travel, and real estate. In the late 20th century, Hong Kong had carved out a niche for itself by marrying the market access, labor populations, financial flows, technologies, and economic opportunities of East and West. It could not have done this without the US trading system, but it also could not have done it without the reopening of mainland China. Hong Kong's growth has always been tied up with the mainland. Without that major policy shift on the mainland, Hong Kong would be a very different place. When Deng Xiaoping seized control of China after Mao's death in 1976, the country was in shambles. Both of Mao's attempts at national self-transformation had been disastrous failures, and China was careening towards another cataclysmic period of famine and social breakdown. To prevent further chaos, Deng combined new forms of population control and societal mobilization with the classic economic tactic of reopening China's ports. Or in other words, China also joined the American trading system. In the late 1970s, the mainland government created China's first special economic zones, coastal enclaves where normal commerce and trade were allowed for the first time in almost 30 years. The initial zones were in the Pearl River Delta region, Hong Kong's backyard. It was clear the colony would be essential to the commercialization, industrialization, and modernization of China, but Deng Xiaoping had to work a careful balance. Hong Kong's utility had to be balanced against touchy national grievances over colonialism, imperialism, and national unification. Deng's solution was the now famous one country, two systems framework. This framework is a clever attempt to balance mainland China's twin needs of national unity and economic development. Here's Deng Xiaoping in 1984. Quote, "We are pursuing a policy of one country, two systems. More specifically, this means that within the People's Republic of China, the mainland, with its 1 billion people, will maintain the socialist system, while Hong Kong and Taiwan continue under the capitalist system." End quote. Originally, this phrase meant that there would be a capitalist system in Hong Kong and socialism in China. The one country, two systems scheme went hand in hand with the process of reopening the ports and allowing in foreign capital. Here's Deng Xiaoping again. Quote, "Opening a number of cities on the mainland will let in some foreign capital, which will serve as a supplement to the socialist economy and help promote the growth of the socialist productive forces." End quote. At its core, this policy is an attempt to get the economic benefits of opening up the ports without any of the political consequences. It is a contortion that tries to let China have its cake and eat it too. This misty phrase was meant to convince everyone, the Chinese government included, that the mainland's political and economic needs could both be met with one policy. Unfortunately, this is impossible. At best, it could only push the inevitable conflict farther out into the future. Nonetheless, this principle became the essence of the official agreement negotiated between Britain and China over Hong Kong's status once Britain's 99-year lease on part of the colony ended in 1997. From 1982 to 1984, the two negotiated what came to be known as the Sino-British Declaration. This declaration is what guarantees Hong Kong's relative independence and democracy for 50 years following its July 1st, 1997 handover date to mainland China. These negotiations were also what prompted Britain to turn Hong Kong into a democracy in the first place. Only the reality of the looming return date motivated Britain to stop dragging its feet on that point. The agreement is an attempt to square the circle of transitioning Hong Kong to democracy and protecting its capitalist economy while also preparing to hand it over to a totalitarian state. It should not be a surprise that politicians were not able to figure this one out. The only reason the declaration provided a stable foundation for relations is because decades of almost uninterrupted economic growth made people want to believe it would work, and because Hong Kong and the West convinced themselves Beijing would change. Much of the West sees this declaration as a binding treaty of international law. In China, not so much. In 2017, China's foreign ministry announced that it did not see the declaration as legally binding, despite the fact that the document says, quote, "The whole makes up a formal international agreement, legally binding in all its parts. An international agreement of this kind is the highest form of commitment between two sovereign states." End quote. Regardless of what the words may say, to the Chinese government, any agreement with Britain on Hong Kong is a little too close to a disgraceful homage to its humiliations in the 19th and early 20th centuries. China proposed 50 years because this time frame was an effective political compromise. It was probably long enough to gain all the economic benefits Beijing needed from Hong Kong, while still being near enough of an end date to avoid national strife or disunity. What happens after 2047 is legally unclear, but considering Beijing's position, pretty obvious to all parties involved. The two systems become one. There is no way Beijing would negotiate with Britain a second time. During the 1980s negotiations, Beijing was weak and willing to bide its time. But it knew that in the end, changes were going to be needed in Hong Kong. At root, Hong Kong's position within the Chinese system is determined by how the Communist Party leadership weighs the relative importance of national unity versus economic growth. When economic growth is paramount, Hong Kong could be accommodated because it is a key intermediary. But once growth faded, as it always does, Hong Kong shifted from an opportunity to a threat. So relations may have seemed tranquil at first, but the moment Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997, the city had already lost its footing, and the only question was when it would slip.